In memory of Sarah Steinberg, Sarah Bas Yehuda Leib, who was very instrumental in our shul in terms of establishing the Russian minyan. L'ili Nishmasa, as well as L'ili Nishmas, Yishai Naftali Hertz ben Reb Tzvi Newman, Elka Bas Dov Ber Sullivan. Neshama should have an aliyah. As we began to discuss last night, there's a lot in this parsha, of course, about the Shviros Haluchos. Moshe Rabbeinu made the decision, which ultimately the Rebbeinu Shalom agreed to break the Luchos. And much of what is behind that decision is part of what the Mefarshim discuss in this week's parsha. But in that parsha of the Shviros Haluchos, you'll notice a lot of differences, nuances in how the word itself, Luchos, is spelled. On the one hand, we know that Luchos has two vavs. Sometimes it's spelled mole in both areas. Both vavs are there. Sometimes it's spelled chaser in both. Neither of the vavs are there. Sometimes one of the vavs is there and one of the vavs is not there. So there are basically four different ways that Luchos could be spelled. It could be spelled with two vavs. It could spell with no vavs. It could be spelled with the first vav and not the second. It could be spelled with the second vav and not the first vav. So is there any method over here? How are we supposed to understand when the Torah describes to spell the Luchos in a particular way? So if it comes to the second vav of Luchos, the vav that would make it mole in terms of describing the plural aspect, that it's not one luach but two luchos, so the Maral Diskin is quoted as having a very fascinating approach in this week's parsha. Most of the time in this week's parsha, the word Luchos is spelled without the second vav. Now, of course, the word Luchos by definition means plural. It's not one luach, it's two. But the vav, which would indicate that it is two luchos, that is most of the cases in our parsha, with the exception of one, I believe, is without that vav. And the Maral Diskin says there's tremendous significance over here. Explains the Maral Diskin based on a concept we've discussed in the past, but he takes it one step further. Maral Diskin points to a very interesting language which bothered me in the Psukim as well. Moshe Rabbeinu says, as we said last night, "Ve'esvos b'shnei haluchos v'ashlichem me'al shtei yodai," and I threw them out from upon my two hands. We would have said, "V'ashlichem mishtei yodai." What's me'al shtei yodai? Says the Maral Diskin, we have to understand what exactly occurred over here. That in fact there was a debate between Moshe Rabbeinu and the Rebbeinu Shalom. We've quoted in the past a very important mahalach, important approach that is developed by many Gedolei Achronim, but very, very powerfully by the Klei Chemda, or Meir Don. The Klei Chemda writes how, when one thinks about it, one could make the argument that really Moshe Rabbeinu, even if he wanted to break the Luchos, he really should have broken only one Luach. We know many different Shittas in Chazal, but the Rishonim seem to adopt the position that one of the Luchos had Bein Adam L'Makom and the other had Bein Adam L'Chaveru. If that's the case, says Rameir Dan, says the Klei Chemda, why did Moshe Rabbeinu break both Luchos? He should have only broken the Luach that had Bein Adam L'Makom. After all, it was only that Luach that was violated. Break the Luach that says Anochi Hashem Elokecha, but why are you breaking both of them? Here, says the Maral Diskin, was the debate between Moshe Rabbeinu and the Rebbeinu Shalom. Maral Diskin wants to go as far as to say that Moshe Rabbeinu, in fact, held that should be the case, and Moshe Rabbeinu tried to only break one of the luchos. He only wanted to break the luach that had Bein Adam La Makom. The Rebbeinu Shalom tells them that no, that's not how it works. You think that Bein Adam La Makom, Bein Adam La Chaveru are two separate aspects, two separate entities, two independent entities, and the two aren't dependent one upon the other. That's incorrect. When it comes to Torah Seinu HaKadosh, our approach to Bein Adam La Chaveru is intertwined, is interdependent on Bein Adam La Makom for so many reasons. right? L'reacha kamoicha, ani Hashem. The ani Hashem and v'ahavta l'reacha kamoicha are one and the same. Part and parcel of how we treat another Jew is because that Jew was created b'tzelem Elokim. It has a nefesh Eloiki. That Jew has a chelek Elokam imal. Part of the v'ahavta l'reacha kamoicha is Ani Hashem. You can't separate the two. If you're going to violate the Ben Adam L'Makam, then you violate the Ben Adam L'Chaveiro. They're one and the same. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu, says the Marodiskin, in fact, tried to break only one of the luach, but v'ashlichem me'al shtei yadai, but both of the luchos flew forward, because Rabbi Shem says it's impossible to break one without breaking the other. V'ashlichem me'al shtei yadai, says Moshe Rabbeinu, and that, says the Marodiskin, is why luchos in our parsha is always spelled, the second vav is not there with the exception of one time, because to tell us that even though it is plural, there were two separate luchos, however the two are really one. They're really interconnected, and therefore it's plural because there were two, but don't think they're two independent, separate entities, and therefore the vav, the second vav, says the Maral Diskin, was taken out to show that it's two that is really one. The Bein Adam L'Makam, Bein Adam L'Chaveiro are really one and the same. That's the L'Chaychem that explains why in the Luchos Shniyos there's that linking vav between the Bein Adam L'Makam, Bein Adam L'Chaveiro. So when you read them together, you would see the vav hachibur is there. The vav is connecting the two. You can't separate the two. Bein Adam L'Chaveiro, from the Torah's perspective, is dependent on the Bein Adam L'Makam. But it's not because there's objective morality how to treat another Jew. No, it's because he's a Chelek Elokam Imal, and the Rebbeinu Shem says that's how you treat him. The Ani Hashem is what drives the V'ahavta l'reacha kamoicha as well, and therefore that second vav is taken out to show it's plural, but it's really still only one. But what bothered me is still, what about the first vav? Why sometimes is it spelled with the first vav between the lamed and the ches, and sometimes in our parsha it's spelled without that first vav? And it's hard to understand. It's hard to wrap your head around, because it seems like almost Chalila the Torah is doing it randomly. Well, sometimes within one pasuk it's with the vav, and then the next word in the same pasuk is without the vav. And of course, this is all very, very deep Torah, and we have to understand. We may not be able to understand every nuance tonight, but let's try to at least give an approach of when that first vav is there and spelled luchos with the first vav, and when it's spelled luchos without the first vav. It's an approach which is similar to something I saw from Reb David Cohen, but slightly different. And that is based on a concept which we've discussed in the past. It's a concept which comes from the Goyin. I believe it's even before the Goyin, but the Goyin discusses this very often. Reb Chaim Kanievsky in the Sefer Taimid Dekra often uses this principle. We've discussed it in the past, and that is, when something is spelled chaser, that means there is something missing. It's the same word, it's pronounced the same, because the Torah is telling you what happened, but you should know that there's something lacking, and therefore it is spelled chaser. I think the first time the Gra says this is when the tremendous assets of Lavan Harasha are described, and the pasuk says over there in Parshas Vayetze, U'masher Lavinu Oses Kol HaKovoid Hazeh. All this tremendous honor. Look how wealthy Lavan is, but we know Ein Kavod Ella Torah. That's not real kavod, that you're a rich person, and therefore, says the Goyin, kavod is spelled without a vav, because that's not real kavod. It says the Goyin, you go throughout Chamishay Chumshay Torah, every time something's spelled chaser, there's a reason it's spelled chaser, and very often Reb Chaim Kanievsky will tell us what that reason is. So I was so hopeful, I opened up my time in the Qur'an trying to understand why is Luchos sometimes spelled without the vav, but unfortunately he was not megala to us, at least as far as I could see in time of the Qur'an, Reb Chaim Kanievsky. So we have to try on our own to grasp at straws. Why is it that sometimes that first vav, the second vav, the Maral Diskin told us already why it's not there, but that first vav, why is it sometimes there, and why is it sometimes not there? So perhaps we could understand based on a concept, again, we've discussed many, many times, but we'll apply it to this conversation as well. And we know, it's something, a medrash, it's Yerushalmi really, that we've discussed often. It's something we know from the time we're children. And that is that when Moshe Rabbeinu saw the Egel, or when Klal Yisrael were over the Isser of the Egel, the Oisiyos of the Luchos were parchos ba'avir. They flew up into the sky. Now, whatever that means, obviously it means that there was some element of the Luchos that were lacking over here, right? Like the Beis Halevi tells us, the Luchos are used to encapsulate all of Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. The Luchos Shniyos is just Torah Shebechsav. There was something lacking after the Chet HaEgel. Some go as far as to describe it like we discussed last night in great detail. The Yerushalmi tells us that the Luchos were tremendous. The Luchos were the size of a mikvah. They were Arba'im Sa'ah. How was it possible Moshe Rabbeinu was carrying such a thing, stone so big? Says the Yerushalmi, obviously, they were noisais as atzmon. They carried themselves. What does that mean, they carried themselves? Well, we know that something that's alive carries itself. We have a halachic principle. Chai noisais atzma. When something's dead, it's dead weight. It's much heavier. Say the mefarsh, what the Yerushalmi means is that the luchos, like we discussed last night, choros, right? It was choros ala luchos. There was a neshama in the luchos. That's how it overcame its physical limitations. That's how I mem v'samach shabeluchos bin neisay omdos. It's almost like the Torah that was instilled within these stones was an neshama in these stones, and when Chayal Yisrael were chayte, what it means that that the oisios were parchos ba'avir, it means the neshama left, the luchos died, and they became so heavy. Moshe Rabbeinu had to throw them down. It was a transition that took place between the luchos, the way they should have been, with kol ha-Torah kula, with the full neshama, with everything there, the no need for Torah Shebal Peh, the way that Nesinas HaTorah, Matan Torah could have been. And then after Chet HaEgel, there's a transition. These luchos no longer encapsulate what they used to encapsulate. Even the Luchos Shniyos don't encapsulate what they used to encapsulate originally. And I was thinking, there's a very, very interesting, seemingly redundant pasuk in this week's parsha. It's very, very bothersome as well. If you take a look at the parsha that's discussing the Shviras HaLuchos, the Torah tells us as well. Moshe Rabbeinu says, in Perek Tes Pasuk Yud, Vayiten Hashem Elias Shnei Luchos Avonim Ksuvam. Right, the Rebbeinu Hashem gave me the two luchos. Be'etzba Elokim, written by the Rebbeinu Hashem Ksuvim Be'etzba Elokim. V'aleihem kechol advar meshadiber Hashem mochem mitbahar mitoich ha'esh and b'yem hakol. Everything that the Rebbeinu Hashem said in Matan Torah was written on these two luchos. Pasuk Yud. Comes Pasuk Yud Aleph and says, Vayehi miketz arba'im yom v'arbim layla noson Hashem Elias shnei luchos ha'avonim luchos habris. What do you mean? You just told me. Vayitein Hashem Elias shnei luchos ha'avonim ksuvim be'etzba Elokim. That's what the pasuk right before says. It says, "Ve'eshe bahar abrim yom v'abrim layla, vayiten Hashem Elias shnei luchos ha'avonim ksuvim be'etzba Elokim v'aleim kol dvarim." Everything was there. So what's pasuk Yud Aleph coming and saying? Vayi miketz arba'im yom v'abrim layla. After 40, you just told me. After 40 days, the Rebbeinu Hashem gave me the luchos. What are you saying now? Vayi miketz arba'im yom v'abrim layla nasan Hashem Elias shnei luchos ha'avonim. It seems like the second pasuk Yud Aleph is adding absolutely nothing. So of course the Nitziv is me'orer this question, and the Tziv says a very, very interesting idea which needs more thought and more serious study to fully understand. But the Nitziv says that one of these psukim is talking about the beginning of 40 days, when Moshe Rabbeinu was first given the luchos but not fully taught the entirety of Torah. The second pasuk is talking about the end of 40 days, when Moshe Rabbeinu was taught all of Torah Shebal Peh. That's the approach of the Nitziv, an interesting approach. One has to figure out exactly how it fits into the words of the psukim. But perhaps we could suggest a tremendous, tremendous chiddush, maybe something that is not substantiated by the psukim enough, but mitoch chomer hakasha, maybe we'll suggest it. We'll see what the Olam thinks. We know that the Yerushalmi tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu goes up and is mekabel the luchos, but then the Rebbeinu Shalom sees the Chet HaEgel. Rebbeinu Shalom sees the Chet HaEgel. Says the Yerushalmi, Rebbeinu Shalom wanted them back. Rebbeinu Shalom wanted the luchos back. Says Moshe Rabbeinu, give me the luchos back. They violated it already. I want the luchos back. Moshe Rabbeinu says, no, you gave them to me already. I'm holding on to them. Says Yerushalmi, Hafla v'fela. Kevin she'asi Yisrael oisa ma'aseh, bikesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu lechoitfan miyado. The Rebbeinu Shem tried to take the Luchos Avonim back from Moshe Rabbeinu. V'gavra yadai shal Moshe v'chatu yimei. The Rebbeinu Shem was trying to grab them. Moshe Rabbeinu was misgaber kaviyachal and took them back. And that's what the pasuk says. Hu she'akasim mishabach v'oimer ulechol hayara chazakah. The last pasuk in the Torah, yara chazakah. Why are we saying Moshe Rabbeinu, you were so strong? The Rebbeinu Shem is the yara chazakah. Where did Moshe Rabbeinu yara chazakah? We wouldn't have the Torah. We wouldn't have the Luchos if not for Moshe Rabbeinu's strength that he was able to pull the Luchos out. So we see that there was a giving of the Luchos. The Rebbeinu Shem tried to yank them back. And Moshe Rabbeinu, obviously, all Hapi Moshe, these are much deeper things, but Moshe Rabbeinu said, no, I'm keeping them, I'm holding on to them. Perhaps we could suggest that that's why these two psukim are over here. Why does it say the Rebbeinu Shem gave me the Luchos in Pasuk Yud? And then again, Pasuk Yud, the Rebbeinu Shem gave me the Luchos, there was something that happened in the middle. The Rebbeinu Shem gave me the Luchos, but then the Rebbeinu Shem saw Cheda Egel, he wanted the Luchos back. Moshe Rabbeinu said, no. The Rebbeinu Shem gave me the Luchos, and I won that fight. Maybe the first pasuk is before Cheda Egel, when Moshe Rabbeinu originally got the Luchos, but then the Rebbeinu Shem wanted them back. So Moshe Rabbeinu says again, no, he gave them to me. I took them, and I wasn't able. He gave them to me, and I didn't let him take them back. And he saw that I wasn't giving them back, so he says, Kum raid my hair, go down. So the two psukim seem to be saying the same thing, but really there's such an essential difference that happens in the occasion that happens in between them. The first one, Moshe Rabbeinu was giving them willingly, but then the Rebbeinu Shem wanted to take it back. The second one, he was giving them against Kaviyachal, the Rebbeinu Shem's will. If this is the case, so then we could perhaps understand when it says Luchos with the Vav and when it says Luchos without the Vav. If that, between these two psukim, is when the Cheda Egel happened, and that's when that struggle between the Rebbeinu Shem and Moshe Rabbeinu took place, before this Cheda Egel, if this is where the Cheda Egel took place, you'll notice Luchos is always spelled with a Vav. Why? Because it was the Luchos in the full sense of the word. It was the way the Luchos should have been, with all of Torah Shebal Peh and everything there, and therefore it's Malay. But then, after Cheda Egel, in Pasuk Yud Aleph and further, it's always spelled without the Vav. Why? Because that's the point of Cheda Egel, and that's when Oisios Parchas Ba'avir, the Luchos were never in the full sense, the way the Luchos should have been ever again. And therefore, the Vav is taken out. Like the Goin tells us, whenever there's a missing Vav, it means something is lacking. If we are correct that this struggle between Rebbeinu Shem and Moshe Rabbeinu took place at exactly this point in the Torah, so it makes a lot of sense why the Vav is dropped. Because before this point in the Torah, the Luchos were on the level the Luchos should have been, with Torah Shebichsav and Torah Shebal Peh, with the Oisiyos, B'neis Hayu Oindim, everything the way that they should have been, Mitchilasan. But after this point, the Neshama of the Luchos leaves. Oisiyos Parches Ba'avir. The Luchos will never be the same again, and therefore the Vav is dropped. It's Luchos without a Vav. I wish you all a good night.